Today I am sitting here with Dr. Joan Heminway. Joan is a professor in the law school at the University of Tennessee. She was also one of the first faculty advisors for SEAT, Sexual Empowerment and Awareness at Tennessee, the student organization that runs Sex Week. Joan is going to talk to us today about her ongoing experiences with Sex Week. So, Joan, to begin, could you tell us a little bit about your background coming to the University of Tennessee before taking over as the faculty advisor for SEAT?
Yes, had nothing to do with sex, actually. I worked in the Boston office of an international law firm called Skadden Arps, Slate, Meagher and Flom. It is a pretty large firm that does a lot of business law, and that's where I got my business law background to teach what it is that I now teach at the University of Tennessee, mergers and acquisitions, corporate finance work of a general sort. And about, 17, 18 years ago now, I felt that something was missing in my life, and I was having a calling to do something different, and that's what led me to switch completely from the practice of law to the academic pursuit of law by teaching and engaging in scholarship. So the student body here didn't seem very engaged, to be honest, around about 2000 when I arrived. And yet maybe that was partially because I was transitioning from practice to academia and didn't really have as much awareness, especially of the undergraduate student population. The law school tends to be somewhat separate. The law students were pretty active, but they were active in public service. I thought that was really amazing. It was very consistent, obviously, with the land grant mission of the university, but I didn't see as much from the undergraduates. There weren't big protests like I remember happening at Brown about all kinds of little things. And so I guess I really didn't have much of a student awareness until I was working with the Faculty Senate, which happened a number of years in. I took a short term with the Faculty Senate and then was reelected to a 3-year term. And then at the end of that 3-year term, I became the president-elect of the Faculty Senate, and then the president, and then the past president. And all of that sort of immediately preceded my assuming the faculty advisor position to sexual empowerment and awareness at Tennessee. I think there was student engagement, I just wasn't seeing it. And yet when I got into the Senate, they were helping us as a faculty to do things in parallel. The student government and the Faculty Senate were adopting resolutions around the same issues that affected campus life.
Why do you suppose it is that they approached you as a faculty advisor?
The way this happened is a bit of legend, as among those of us who were there at the time. I was at a meeting, as we often are on campus, at the Golden Rose. That's where all the elite meet, right? I was on my way out the door and I ran into Lynn Sacco, with whom I had also worked when I was in the Faculty Senate. She was the head of the LGBT Commission for one of the years that I was there. And she was sitting talking to Brianna Rader and Jacob Clark, who were the founders of Sexual Empowerment and Awareness at Tennessee. Mm-hmm. She waved me over, or fairly grabbed me on the way out the door and said, "Do you have a minute? I want you to meet these 2 students." And she pulled me down to this table. And I said, okay. It was summer, so, your time's a little more flexible. I sat down and started chatting with them, and they shared this idea of having an entire week of sex education programming called Sex Week. And I almost fell off my chair backwards, because I said, that's crazy. You can't do that at the University of Tennessee. That's going to, we had just been through a fight to even have what's now known as the Pride Center. It had been a huge battle with the chancellor and legislators, informal battle behind the scenes to just get that funded and get that up and running. They looked at me and they were not going to take no for an answer, Brianna and Jacob, and said, no, hear us out. Here's what's going on. And they spoke to me about research that they had done on sex-positive sex education. They spoke to me about a speaker that had come the year before who was a sexologist, a term I didn't know back then. In addition, they both were very aware of some things going on campus that they shared with me. They shared particular stories. They knew that there were students on campus who were securing roofies in order to take advantage of women. They knew that from their research on Tennessee that the rate of sexually transmitted infections in Tennessee was among the highest in the country, that the rate of pregnancy in their age group, that undesired pregnancies, was among the highest in the country. They felt that all of these things together just spoke to having more conversations about sex. And I understood where they were coming from. The more we talked, I learned that they both had gone to school in Tennessee. They both were Tennesseans. They were about the same age as my kids. My kids went to school in Tennessee. There was just not sex education in high school in Tennessee. And so they were also trying to overcome a deficit. And so I think I stayed for a half an hour or an hour after that meeting was over, talking to them. They had convinced me by the end of this time that this was an amazingly powerful idea. And Lynn, at that time, said, you should have Joan on your team because she just came out of this term as the Faculty Senate president and past president. and she knows the campus administration, and you're going to obviously have to get them behind you in order to do this. So the reason why I got asked to serve as an advisor and not just on their sort of group of friends, because they have a large group of faculty friends, was to put them in touch with the campus administration. My thought on it was that the word sex was inflammatory. The kinds of programs that they had in mind, even though they were tamping them down from what other schools like Brown and Harvard were doing, was it was the words that were going to get them in trouble. But I thought, well, the campus administration will work with them. Maybe the words will mellow. I had no inkling at that time that we were going to be, about 8 months later, embroiled in an informal controversy with the legislature over that program. So the spring of 2013, Sex Week was being held, for better or for worse, the week after spring break. It was about the Wednesday or Thursday before spring break that I got an emergency call from Brianna and Jacob. They were pretty distraught. They had just finished a meeting where they were told that the university's funding for Sex Week would be completely removed. So they had about 11 days left before the program was starting. They had speakers getting on airplanes. They had spent a lot of money that needed to be backfilled on marketing, promotion. We're talking about a big budget. We're talking about, I think it was over $20,000 that year. So that capped off a number of weeks of controversy in the press. There are certain folks that follow campus activities from I'll call them now alt-right press, that started bringing up the titles of the programs. There was a website for the program, and fabricating, in some cases, stories about the speakers and what they were coming to talk about. We thought that the controversy was all a media firestorm. We didn't really understand that behind the scenes, the campus and university administration were facing a lot of pressure from legislators who were commenting in the press, but we really didn't understand the level of discontent until the campus withdrew its funding. That was unfortunate. There was funding for a lot of programs in there that were academic programs involving UT faculty, and so it represented, in my mind, a light form of censorship. On the other hand, the program went forward. How did it go forward? It went forward because student activity fees funded a lot of it, but a crowdfunding campaign raised a bunch of money, and a bunch of local organizations chipped in as well. So we weren't able to make up the whole deficit, but we cut some expenses and made Sex Week happen 10 days later. Mm-hmm. But in that next year, because student activity fees had come to the rescue, student activity fees were what ended up being put on the legislative table ultimately. Initially, the legislature wanted to focus on Brianna and Jacob, the two founders of Sex Week. And in fact, a resolution circulated and was reported in the press that basically condemned them. And that was very troubling for Brianna and Jacob. It turns out the legislature finally got persuaded that was an unduly nasty thing to do by our campus and university administration, as I understand it. And so instead, they substituted the chancellor and the president for Brianna and Jacob and excoriated them in a resolution. Luckily, the resolution was sort of a compromise from a real legislative action that would have had immediate effect on the university. In return for not engaging in legislative activity, not only did the resolution make some progress in the legislature, but the university and the campus agreed to change the funding structure for student activities on campus. The concern of the legislature, as it had been expressed, is that too much money was going to causes on one end of the political spectrum and not enough on another. And so we needed to change the process to make sure that funds were distributed more evenly. That's at least the story in the background. What it resulted in was changing what had been a student-led exercise for student programming into a faculty and staff-led exercise for student programming. The committee became dominated majority-wise by faculty and staff and left the students in a minority role in determining the funding of their own activity fee programs.
Mm-hmm. I know when you and I spoke before, we talked about strategy that you see the legislature applying. And
as an outsider, we can sort of see these things. So that effort began, as you suggested, in the spring term of the university, which is really the winter and the beginning of the legislative term, and seemed to be rather strategically timed. And in fact, over the next few years, as things accelerated, the strategic timing seemed to accelerate for a lot of these activities. Again, this may be mere coincidence, but it seems unlikely. So at the very times when, note that the first incident in the first year occurred right before spring break week. Very little time for students and faculty to react and be able to be coordinated in their reaction. We tried hard. We were on the telephone and going from different areas of the country, but it wasn't optimal for overcoming things. In that second year, things ramped up, of course, as Sex Week was coming to a head again. And so our students are fighting two different battles. They're fighting a legislative battle and a reputational battle, on one side, and then they're just trying to fight the battle of event planning, which for anybody who's done event planning is non-trivial, right? So that was the second year. The third year, we had sort of a bit of a break. There wasn't a lot happening. I think it was a pre-election year, and so everybody was sort of moving around behind the scenes. It was the first year the new activity fee happened, but after Sex Week happened, there was a reaction like, what, Sex Week still happened? We changed the activity fee. I can't believe that happened. So last year, and this was the timing of each of these things I see as being quite coordinated, and in the end, the legislation was quite coordinated. At the beginning of the school year, when a gender-neutral pronoun suggestion was posted for faculty, the legislature reacted right then, beginning of the school year, very difficult time for everybody to, again, get coordinated and move on something. During the holiday time when people are studying for exams, the holiday party craziness hit, and it became the war against Christmas, quote unquote, on campus. And then during that whole time, in the background, there was a lot of discussion about Sex Week and what's happening with Sex Week, and we have to put a damper on Sex Week in some way. And diversity and inclusion is the thing that connects all of these things, right? All of them were different efforts in some way toward diversity and inclusion, and Sex Week just got thrown in with the whole bundle. So the Sex Week piece of things, again, happened strategically in the spring, right before Sex Week. The legislature dealt with all of the diversity and inclusion things at the same time, and the bill ended up including all three of those incidents. The incidents, we'll put in quotes, in addition to a general fee restriction on spending for diversity and inclusion on campus.
Would you mind just talking a little bit about how Sex Week fits in with this picture of diversity and inclusion that we're talking about?
Absolutely. So while a lot of the catalysts for Sex Week were things like sexually transmitted infection issues, were things like sexual assault on campus issues, also in the background was the knowledge that people can get sexually transmitted infections if they're not having sex with someone heterosexually, right? So the whole issue of sex had to incorporate different ways in which people express their sexuality. So that got into the LGBTQIA community right there. In addition, we had a bunch of issues on campus with respect to the use of gendered pronouns in forms that Sex Week took on as one of the issues. The drag show, which had been going on for years and years, got incorporated into Sex Week, and that, cross-dressing is considered to sort of be put into that same sort of mix of diversity and inclusion. The fact that the program every year has in it at least one panel on religion and sex, because there is a direct academic and practical tie in there. What religions say about sex and how sex can be had and when sex can be had and whether sex is to be discussed or not is a huge issue. And so we've had panels every year where we've had academics and practitioners in religion deal with things. So it involves really sex as a core part of life, as a core part of the life cycle, involves all of this. And so the program involved all of this. And so it got thrown into a whole debate about inclusion of everyone, inclusion of people who want to talk about sex. Tennessee is the state, where we had the Scopes trial. There's a legacy in this state of repressive speech that's connected to religion and a bunch of other things that are part of the whole diversity and inclusion bundle. So while it may not be obvious, if you think about it and you look at the programs over the years, you'll see that the programs invoke a diversity and inclusion aspect, but that the discussion of sex, implicitly actually has to include everyone and how they process and handle issues relating to sex.
Do you think that the initial attack on Sex Week and the concessions that were made with regard to student funding, do you think that paved the way for the legislature's actions with regard to the Office of Diversity in the Pride Center last year?
I actually do see a connection. I may be in a minority on that, but the fact that the legislature was engaged nearly annually from the 2013 legislative session on to today with the Sex Week issue and with our administration, and the fact that the administration was conceding in every year a little bit more. I like to say it's like a slow roll downhill, right? The legislature, would ask us for something that was a mile out, and we would say, no, not a mile. We'll give you a half a mile. And then the next year they would ask for an additional half a mile, and we would say, oh, no, we'll only take half of that. Before we knew it, we had compromised nearly our entire position from the first year over a period of years. That process, I think, gave the legislature a feeling of empowerment. They could come back at us with these related issues, other things where they felt that, quite honestly, the speech on campus and the associations on campus were things that a majority of the legislature did not want to see happening on a public university campus. Basically gave them the idea, well, maybe if we keep doing this on all of these things, if we keep pushing them, because we have the power of the purse. Yeah. We hold the funds, even though it's now only, 20% of our budget or something. But it's still a significant part of our funding, right? We can hold those purse strings and say, no, you can't do this, or you need to do that, began to micromanage the budget. And I think that started with Sex Week, and it started with managing behind the scenes that money the first year. And you have to remember there are certain legislators who have a strong role in this over time. In the beginning, it was Stacey Campfield, who was first a representative and then a senator from the Knoxville area. And most recently, it's become Martin Daniel, who's assumed that mantle. And so with a strong leader behind the scenes, sort of pushing the envelope and looking back and understanding the history and trying to figure out, here's where we were, here's where we got to. Maybe if we ask for this year, we can push the envelope and get more than what we originally really wanted in that first year.
Mm-hmm. What difficulties do you anticipate moving forward with SEAT?
I would anticipate continued legislative involvement. Last year, in connection with the floor debates on the massive diversity and inclusion bill that included Sex Week by name, as well as the gender-neutral pronoun and Christmas issues, and the defunding of our campus office for diversity and inclusion. So it was a big bill, lots of stuff on diversity and inclusion. The legislature, there were questions asked on the floor in the House debate. And among those questions was a questioner who said, okay, so the bill does not allow support for or promotion of the Sex Week program. Does support mean things like utilities, and I'm paraphrasing here, and building access? And the sponsor of the bill said yes. And the legislator from the floor said, does that mean that there will be no Sex Week, at the University of Tennessee? And the sponsor of the bill then said yes. So I think at least those two people, if not others, who were on the floor, who were applauding and huzzahing in the background, after that colloquy, once they learn that Sex Week is being held in the spring, I think there may be some pushback. Exactly what the nature of that pushback is, I can't tell you. It would be complicated to attempt to censure the University of Tennessee legally for that. The state is represented by its own legal counsel, the Attorney General. And so if the legislature wanted to ask for the University of Tennessee to be legally censured, they would need to go through the Attorney General to do that, or hire their own counsel, I suppose. They could. This is a very irregular procedure. I doubt that will happen between you and me. I think the pressure will continue to be more informal in the background, if there is any. And what form it will take, I don't know, but it will involve the fact that they will threaten to remove some funding from something at the university. That seems to be the MO of the legislature right now. First it was activities fees, then we sort of exhausted that area. Now we've gotten into budgetary line items, sort of moving funds around on the campus. That same thing clearly could happen with another part of the budget and in retaliation for Sex Week, because now Sex Week is mostly funded by student activity fees through the new program, by private donations, and including, we hope to get some grants at some point or another from nonprofits, but we've had, for example, funding from Planned Parenthood because we participate in programs that are consistent with its mission. So to be able to get that kind of funding has been helpful, but what they'll take money from and where it will go, I don't know. I just know that there's a strong sentiment against this program, and everything short of something that the legislature will be advised immediately and that the governor would be advised was a constitutional violation on its face, is up for grabs.
Mm-hmm. You were talking a minute ago about this proposed bill. If I understood it correctly, they're trying to claim control over the speech at the University of Tennessee on the grounds that this is publicly funded space and publicly funded.
So this is the actual bill. The bill that was adopted includes a section in it that says that that university funds, that state funds, can't be used to promote Sex Week or to support Sex Week, right? So support, that word doesn't have a classified legal meaning. It's not a term of art. And so the colloquy on the floor of the House was, what does it really mean to support, right? Does electricity bills, does the maintenance of a building, does that mean support? And the sponsor of the bill, his impression was, yes. That was what clearly he intended. Whether that's the intent of the entire legislature, including the other body of the legislature that was not in that room at that time, I can't tell you. So I don't know whether the sentiment is entirely, that way. But yes, you read it properly. If read strictly in accordance with what the bill's sponsor thought those words meant, it would be, in my view, a content-based free speech restriction. This forced us last summer as advisors to the two current advisors, myself and it's no longer Lynn Sacco, but Mary McAlpin, who are the current advisors to the student organization, to sit down with the students and work out a plan as to how we moved forward. And so, we knew that we might not be able to reserve rooms, for example, on campus, and so we contacted the Office of the General Counsel and asked, if there was going to be a problem with us reserving rooms for the program. And the answer that we got back is, at this time, we're not going to prevent you from securing rooms, which is not exactly a warm and fuzzy answer. On the other hand, I think that's the best they can do under the circumstances. They're caught a bit between a rock and a hard place. They can listen to that floor debate. It's online. It's a video, as much as anyone else can, and understand what at least some people understood that bill and the word support to mean in that context. But so far we have rooms reserved. I just think that there will be certain people who will be in the legislature who will be frustrated by that.
Well, this bill seems to set an ominous and, in my opinion, my non-expert opinion, unconstitutional precedent, because what could then prevent the legislature from passing a bill saying, for instance, that university funds will not be used in support of, say, the teaching of evolution in a biology classroom, or that university spaces will not be used for that? What besides the guarantee of free speech in the Constitution would prevent them from doing that?
So this is my concern, of course, also, and this is where all of this ties into the academic freedom of the academics who participate, as well as general free speech concerns relating to what is an educational program. Which, after all, it's one thing to just talk about free speech restrictions, but where free speech, as you suggest, impacts education, our ability to educate people who come into our doors for that education in a state as opposed to a religious-based institution. I am to say that I'm frightened or scared that this is a slippery slope would be understating it. This is, for me, this may represent the Maginot Line. As I suggested, we're getting closer and closer to a point where I think we've we've exhausted sort of our options, and at some point or another, someone needs to stand up on this campus, other than the students who've been standing up for it all along, and say, this is an educational program, it's a student-led program. We don't restrict that kind of speech unless it reaches a constitutional norm where we can do that, where it puts other people in danger, for example, incites violence.
The students are not shouting fire in a crowded
They're
theater.
not shouting fire in a crowded theater. They're talking about something that is a natural part of life, and that people express in different ways, just as there are other expressions, in other aspects of our life. And that's the message that has not gotten to a lot of the public. That's the message that the legislature doesn't want to hear. Some of that maybe is our fault as a campus and as a university for not taking a stronger stand earlier and making that point over and over again until we were beating our heads against the wall. On the other hand, it may have meant that more significant repercussions were taken earlier, but maybe that would have brought this matter to a head earlier, because at some point or another, we are going to reach the constitutional issue. We are going to reach that point where somebody's going to say uncle, and there's going to be a real battle about this, about whether we can educate students on this campus, whether it's through student-led programming or faculty programming, in the way that we believe is best and that incorporates notions of free speech and inclusion. And that's what this is really about in the end.
Well, Joan, this is the final question that I have for you today, and it's the same question that I ask everybody that I interview, and that is there any aspect of the story that you believe has been overlooked or needs to be remembered for posterity years down the line?
I think the fact that students founded and led an organization over now a period of 5 years to engage in public education, a week-long series of programs. There's not a unit on campus that does anything as complex and as sensitive to community values as this group does. I think the founders have not been lauded enough. I think the students that do this every year, many of whom are honor students, they have heavy loads here at the university. They're not lauded enough. Their efforts are not appreciated except by those who are receiving. On the other hand, I've talked to innumerable students who understand that this program is who helped to see them who they are, who they were in college. We all learned sort of who we are. It helped them to see who they were and how they fit into the world, and helped to propel them into success. So I think we forget that students can really help students if we just let them do it, and we should praise them and we should support them in whatever way we can. I don't think we do that enough. And last year's diversity and inclusion debate at least started to give them press. When students were lying down on their backs on the sidewalk, when they were taking banners that were the whole length of the hallway in the library on campus and asking us to sign them, we started to appreciate the fact that students were engaged and were leading us in some ways. And I think we need to turn to them and trust them more often and work with them more often.
Regarding your concern that the founders and students involved in SEAT do not get as much laudation as they deserve, I did commend Jacob and Brianna when I interviewed them for standing their ground after the first confrontation with the legislature, standing their ground when many people probably would have folded. And I think that has carried over into the students involved in SEAT ever since. The students have consistently stood their ground, regardless of what anybody else says.
And the repercussions on them personally, potentially and professionally.
Yeah.
As I raised before, and they inspire me. The students that run SEAT inspire me, and and I'm a law professor. I don't even teach them, but I'm taught by them all the time, and that's powerful good.
Well, we thank you very much for your continuing service in advising and supporting these students. And we thank you very much for your time with us today, Joan.
Thanks, Max.